Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome everyone to our new course, Translation Studies. Our today's lecture will be on the definition and scope of translation. The English word translation derives from the Latin word translatio. Translatio comes from trans and fer. Trans means across and fer means to carry or to bring. Actually, latio is coming from latus, which is the past participle of fer. So, therefore, translatio overall means carrying across or bringing across. So, what carrying across or bringing across in our context, in the context of translation, here it means we carry a text from one language to another language. Translation actually is a mental activity in which a meaning of given linguistic discourse is rendered from one language to another. So, the meaning of given linguistic discourse is translated from one language to another. So, it's the act, translation is the act of transferring the linguistic entities from one language into their equivalents in another language. The language, in this process of translation, there are uh, two languages are involved. First, the one is the source language that needs to be translated, and the second one is the language into which the translation is required. For example, we have a piece of a paragraph of English language, let's suppose, and we need it to be translated into Urdu. So our source language would be English and target language will be Urdu. So here source language and target language are abbreviated respectively SL and TL. The translation process is not easy, and because of the laboriousness of translation process since 1940s, efforts have been made with varying degrees of success to automate translation to help human translator. And more recently, the rise of internet has fostered a worldwide market for translation services and has facilitated language localization. Uh, Due to its prominence of translation, translation has been viewed differently, and many people have defined it their own way. So here we will see some of the definitions, and we will see how people see the translation process. First, we have this definition by Ghazala, uh, that it says that translation is generally used to refer to all the process and methods used to convey the meaning of the source language into the target language. So here, in this definition, focuses on the notion of meaning. I mean, the meaning in this definition is as an essential element in translation. So it means that when translating, understanding the meaning of the source text is vital. So it's very important that you understand the meaning of the source text. So why? So that we can have appropriate equivalent in the target text. So when if we do not understand the meaning of the source text uh, in its true sense, so then it will be very difficult to find appropriate equivalent in the target text. So the meaning, according to this definition, that is translated in relation to grammar, style, and sounds. And in what grammar, style, and sound all together, what meaning they produce in the source language, so that meaning is translated into the target language according to this definition. Next we have from Catford. Catford, according to him, he says, translation is the replacement of textual material in one language by equivalent textual material in another language. So he says that this process is the replacement of textual material in one language, and is replaced by what? By the equivalent textual material in another language. So one of the explanations of this definition is that a translation is a process in the sense which is an activity performed by people through time when expressions are translated into simpler ones, okay, in the same language. So this means that through the time, like Urdu language or English language in the last century, 100 or 200 years ago, was different, and now we do not understand that version of our own language even. So we need to reword it or paraphrase it. So this is also counted by Catford as translation, so that we know as rephrase or paraphrase. So, but he says this is one aspect of translation, and the second aspect, according to him, is that it can also be done from one language into a different language also. So the target language can be the same language and as well as a different language. Third definition, according to the third definition here, in general terms, the translation transforms the text of a source language into a correct and understandable version of the target language without losing the original suggestion. So here, so translation means that we transform the source language text into the correct and understandable version of the target language. So we understand, but it should be up to the level that it doesn't lose the original suggestion. Fourth definition that is included here, it says that translation is an act through which the content of a text is transferred from the source language into the target language. That translation is an act through which the content of a text is transferred from the source language into the target language. More or less the same thing is coming here, just with little variation. Next we have translation is communication of meaning from one language to another language. So here it says the communication of meaning, same thing as we saw in the first definition of Ghazala. So it's the communication of meaning from source to target language. Okay, so next we have translation is the communication of the meaning of a source language text by means of an equivalent target language text. So here also again, so the meaning, communication of meanings everywhere, meaning of the source language into the target language. So in fact, translation is a theoretical process for extracting the meaning of a text from its current form and reproducing it with different forms of a second language. So here actually they say that translation, the translator, what he does actually, he decodes the source text first and then recode it into the target language. It means that first he should understand the source text in its true sense. It means he is decoding it in its true sense, and then he can recode it, okay, in the target language and appropriately. So the purpose of translation is to convey the original tone and intent of a message, taking into account cultural and regional differences between source and target languages. So this is very important. I mean, when you translate something, I mean, you should take into your account the cultural and regional regional differences. So something may be appropriate in some culture, but that is not acceptable in our culture. But that may be sometimes, it may be really unacceptable. So a trans is a kind of sensitive job as well in this way. Translating and interpreting. Apparently, they seem very close to each other, but English language draws a terminological distinction between them. This distinction doesn't exist in every language, though. So, but English language has a terminological distinction between translating and interpreting. So, under this distinction, translation can begin only after the appearance of writing within a language community. If there is a language in written form, then translation can begin. So, according to this distinction, if if text is not present within a language community in written form, so translation cannot begin. Then what will happen? That will be a different thing. That will be interpreting. So interpreting is the facilitation of spoken or sign language communication between users of different languages. So interpreting is facilitation of spoken or signed language communication, okay, between users of different language. So interpreting, the process of interpreting, it facilitates the communication between the speakers of two different languages. So the formal ISO definition of interpretation is here. We see rendering a spoken or sign message into another spoken or sign language, preserving the register and meaning of the source language content. So here, this is the definition that from ISO, which is International Standard Organization, that rendering a spoken or sign message into another spoken or sign language. Okay. So you transfer a spoken or sign message from one language into another. In which form? In the same spoken or sign language. But in this process, you preserve the register and meaning of the source language content. There are three primary modes of interpreting: consecutive interpreting, simultaneous interpreting, and sight translation. In simultaneous interpreting, the interpreter listens and renders the message in the target language at the same time as the speaker is speaking. So this is it. In simultaneous interpreting, the interpreter and the speaker, they are speaking at the same time. So you may have seen this somewhere, sometimes some politicians also, they are speaking and the interpreter is also speaking the same time. It's really tough. It's very difficult, I think. One of my colleagues, he was from Egypt. When Obama came to Saudi Arabia, he was his interpreter and he was doing this job. It was really tough, And here I asked him, what's the most important skill you need for this such kind of job? So he said, you have to anticipate, you have to be a quick anticipator. You should have some background knowledge of the subject also. You anticipate what he's talking about, what he may talk about. These things count for good performance in simultaneous interpreting. So here the interpreter listens from one ear and he speaks altogether. So this is a kind of dual task or multitask. Your brain is also working, so it's a multitask, of course. And next, in consecutive interpreting, the interpreter speaks after the source language speaker has stopped speaking. So here, a kind of relaxed job. Once you speak, you stop, and your interpreter translates it or interprets it. So this is comparatively easier than simultaneous interpreting. Next is the third type, third mode of interpreting is side translation. So here the oral rendition of a written text is involved in side translation. So what does it mean? I mean, you do not hear like you hear in simultaneous interpreting or consecutive interpreting, where you just see the text on the written form and then you translate it orally, not in written form. So here, this is the difference in these three modes of interpreting. In first, both speaker and interpreter speak together. Second, the speaker speaks and interpreter listens, and then he speaks and the other one listens, although he doesn't understand. Next, side translation. There is no listening actually. He just sight. He just looks at the text and translates it into the target language orally. This is very important, orally, not in written form. If it's in written form, that will be translation. Okay, but in all the cases, all these three cases, the interpreter must quickly, carefully convey the meaning, the tone, and the intent of the original message into the target language. It doesn't mean that only the first one is difficult and the second and third are easier, so they need different skills, but in all these cases, these three things are very important. That the interpreter conveys the meaning, the tone, and the intent of the original message into the target language. And interpreting requires, what are the requirements for good performance in interpreting? So interpreter must possess excellent language proficiency and should have the ability to quickly analyze. Now, not only analyze, and you may analyze things, but not so. If you're not very quick in analyzing and transferring messages between languages, you cannot be interpreter. You may be a good translator, but here you really need to be quick, like you people are. And adherence to professional ethics and standards of practice. So whatever the professional ethics and standards of practice are established, so interpreter must follow those standards and rules. Interpreting is performed face to face and remotely, both way, not only the face to face only. Remote interpreting requires technological platforms to facilitate telephonic and video multilingual communication. You may have some experience of this, remote interpreting, but I've never seen such a thing. But anyway, this is also done somewhere in the world. Translation. So what's the difference between translation and interpretation? Let's conclude here now. So because we have talked both of these genres of translation. Translation refers to written information, whereas interpretation refers to spoken information. So that's, I mean, what's the outcome? The outcome in the written form is translation, and in the spoken form is interpretation. If you want to be a translator, okay, so let's see some information about how can you be a good translator. Maybe you get some good points here. A translator has always been introducing source language, words, grammar, syntax into the target language that he's rendering. So I mean, he's bringing some words, grammar, syntax, from the source language into the target language. Actually, all this happens unintentionally. I mean, this is not his objective when he translates things, but unintentionally he's bringing material from the source language to the target language. But such spillovers have sometimes imported useful source language corpus and loan words that have enriched target language. But this beautiful mistake, this beautiful error, or this, let's say, some kind of unintentional sport has enriched many target languages. I mean, because they have some loan words, okay, some new vocabulary, some grammar, some syntax rules, so everything. I mean, all these things have enriched many target languages so far. So translators, if you look at the history, including translators from the early ages who translated sacred texts, they have helped shape those languages into which they have translated, the same way that's mentioned before. So many people think that being bilingual is all you need to be a good translator. What do you think? That if you are bilingual, that's all you need to be a good translator? This may not be true. Being bilingual is certainly important prerequisite, but translation skills are developed based on, listen carefully, this is based on your own long and extended experience in two things: in communication and in writing, in both the languages. For example, you are translating, you are using, our Urdu is our mother tongue, so you want to translate some text from Urdu into English, or vice versa. So we should have long and extended experience in communication in both the languages and in writing in both the languages. So if we do not have merely being a bilingual may not be enough, may not be good enough in the beginning, but of course once we start, we acquire some experience, okay, so we will improve gradually. In fact, translation is a theoretical process for extracting the meaning of a text from its current form and reproducing it with different forms of a second language. So you extract meaning through a theoretical process, okay, from the meaning of the text form in its current form, and reproduce this meaning with a different form of a second language. So the translator needs to, therefore, he needs to have a good knowledge of both the source as well as the target language. And one more thing. Listen carefully. This is very important. The most important thing is this for a translator. If you want to be a translator, you have to be linguistically sensitive. You should have a high linguistic sensitivity, because you should as a translator, you should transmit the writer's intention, original thoughts and opinions in the translated version as precisely and faithfully as possible. And if you're not very sensitive, I mean, you may not be able to understand writer's intention, what's his original thought, what's the writer's original thought and opinion is. You may go after just literal meaning, and I mean, you cannot, you may not be able to accomplish the task in its true sense. Well, in general, it is suggested that translators meet three criteria. Three criteria. If you want to be a translator, you must meet these three things. What? Two we just talked about. Knowledge of the source language, the knowledge of target language, and knowledge of the subject, the third one, to do the job well. On the basis of this concept, the translator discovers the meaning of the forms of source language. Okay, first, the translator discovers the meaning of the forms of the source language, and he does everything possible to reproduce the same meaning in the target language. By making how he can reproduce, he will make the best use of target language form and structures. Okay, let's in the last this is the last part of lecture today. Scope. Translation has been used by humans for centuries. I'm sure you are well aware of this. Okay, it began after the appearance of written literature. Modern day translators use sophisticated tools and technologies to accomplish their work and rely heavily on software application to simplify and streamline their tasks. I mean, modern day translators, they do not work like early translators, because now we have support of modern technology, which is really helpful. I mean, it has gone to a great extent so far. We will see this. We have a separate topic of this machine translation later on. But today's translators, they are making use of new technology to produce good quality translations. Organizations around the world, I mean, they're encompassing a multitude of sectors, missions, and mandates, rely on translation for content as diverse as we have a list here, like product labels, technical documentations, user reviews, promotional materials, annual reports, and much more. What's much more? I expect you will explore it. I mean, this is your task also, everyone. Please note this. I'm giving this task orally, so that I mean you see this presentation and you hear this presentation thoroughly. Just elaborate these headings. I mean, how translation is utilized for product labels. I mean, I just tell you, give a hint about these things, but you will explore. You can find material on the web, like product labels. You are producing some products in Pakistan and you want to export them in, for example, in places where Urdu language or English language, or let's say Urdu language is not spoken, it's not used. So you need language of those people there. So for your product labels, you have to translate whatever labels you have in their language. So this is one of the uses of translation. So in this way you can find information about these things, and I would appreciate if you add some more points here, and instead of much more, just add some more headings here. And same you will do in this in the scope of interpretation. I've done the same thing here. What's the scope for interpreters? Of course, the scope for interpreters is different than the scope of translators. So interpreters are employed in a multitude of settings, including courts, schools, medical facilities, social services, national and international institutions, and more. And here you see in courts, you may understand well. I think there's no need to explain it, but I need your explanation under these headings. You will just write. It's not necessary that you write a lot, but just a couple of lines or 5 lines about everything. About all these headings should be enough. That's all for today. Thank you very much. I hope you understand everything. Actually, this was our first lecture, and I'm not a YouTuber, so it was really odd for me to record a lecture. And I'm just sending it to you. If there is any problem or anything, just write on the comments on Easy Class there. There is one option, I suppose, discussion. So you can post your comments if you have any question, if you want any explanation or anything. So you can just write there. Thank you very much, and see you in the next class. Bye-bye. Take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Thank you very much.